The piece of paper trembling in my sweat-slicked fingers was the color of chewed-up bubblegum and carried the legal weight of a localized nuclear strike. I stood there at the end of my perfectly paved driveway, the oppressive midday Florida sun beating down on the back of my neck, staring at a document that was aggressively trying to ruin my life. Boca Raton, Florida, is not just a city. It is a highly manicured, aggressively policed state of mind. It is a place where the palm trees look like they are part of a union, where every blade of St. Augustine grass is legally mandated to stand exactly 2.5 inches tall, and where the air always smells faintly of chlorine, expensive sunscreen, and unearned entitlement. I had moved into the Shady Palms subdivision about a year ago, mostly because the house had good bones and a pool that didn't look like a biological hazard. I wanted peace. I wanted quiet. I wanted to sit on my lanai, drink iced coffee, and pretend the rest of the world didn't exist. Instead, I got Shady Palms. And more specifically, I got Richard Dick Sterling. Before we even get to Richard, let me explain the paper currently acting as a magnifying glass for my boiling rage. It was a certified letter. You don't get certified letters in Boca Raton unless you're being sued, audited, or divorced. The header read, Shady Palms Homeowners Association, Official Notice of Intent to LIEN. My eyes scanned the heavy, bolded text, looking for the crime of the century I had apparently committed. Had I parked a commercial vehicle in my driveway? No. Had I left my garbage cans out past 7 p.m. on a Tuesday? Absolutely not. I'm not a savage. I found the infraction listed on the second page, nestled between threats of legal action and property seizure. Infraction code 4A7, unauthorized alteration of exterior hardware, mailbox signal flag. Fine amount, $15. I blinked. Sweat dripped into my eye, stinging instantly, but I didn't wipe it away. I just stared at the number. $15. I turned my head slowly, like a rusted hinge, and looked at my mailbox. It was a standard, HOA-approved, black cast aluminum receptacle. On the side was the flag. The flag was supposed to be a vibrant, glossy cherry red. However, because this metal box sat completely exposed to the unforgiving radiation-level ultraviolet assault of the South Florida sun for 12 hours a day, the glossy cherry red had faded. It was now a dusty, sun-baked, oxidized magenta. It wasn't even a bad color. It looked like a vintage sunset. But to the Shady Palms HOA, it was apparently a declaration of war. A low, mechanical hum broke my concentration. I knew that sound. Everyone in Shady Palms knew that sound. It was the high-pitched whine of an electric golf cart motor, strained under the weight of too much fiberglass and misplaced authority. I looked down the street, past the identical rows of terracotta roofs and perfectly trimmed hibiscus bushes. Coming around the cul-de-sac, moving at a blistering 12 miles per hour, was the enforcer himself. Richard Sterling. Richard was the president of the Shady Palms Homeowners Association. He was a man who had clearly peaked as a middle manager at a logistics firm in the late 90s and had spent every day since trying to recapture that specific high of denying someone a sick day. He wore pastel polo shirts with the collars aggressively popped, khaki shorts that were always slightly too crisp, and mirrored aviator sunglasses that completely hid his eyes, giving him the appearance of an incredibly annoying, deeply uncool cyborg. His golf cart was a testament to his inflated sense of self-importance. It was a lifted club car onward, painted a custom metallic silver. It had a reinforced brush guard on the front, which was hilarious because the most dangerous thing in this neighborhood was a stray iguana. He had custom alloy wheels, a cooler strapped to the back that I was certain only contained sparkling water and disappointment, and, I kid you not, a police scanner mounted to the dashboard. The cart glided to a halt at the edge of my property line. Richard didn't pull into my driveway. He just hovered there in the street, asserting dominance from the asphalt. He leaned over the steering wheel, resting his forearms on the plastic dash, and pushed his mirrored sunglasses down the bridge of his nose. "Afternoon, Leo," he said. His voice had that grating, overly familiar tone of a guy about to sell you a faulty timeshare. "Richard," I replied, not moving from my spot. I held the pink paper up. "Care to explain why I'm receiving threats of a property lien over a $15 late fee for a mailbox flag?" Richard sighed, a heavy performative sound meant to convey how exhausting it was to deal with peasants like me. He unclipped a clipboard from a holder on his dashboard. Of course he had a clipboard. "It's not a threat, Leo. It's a formal notice," he said, tapping a pen against the metal clip. "We sent you 2 warnings about the flag. You ignored them. The initial fine was $15, which you also ignored. Now we're escalating." "Richard, it's a piece of painted metal," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "It sits in the sun. The sun bleaches things. It's a basic law of physics. It's not like I painted it neon green with a stencil of a skull and crossbones on it." "The bylaws are very clear, Leo," Richard said, his tone shifting into that smug, authoritative register he clearly practiced in the mirror. Section 4, Paragraph A, Subsection 7. All exterior hardware must remain in its original, manufacturer-approved condition. The authorized color for the mailbox flag is cherry crimson, Pantone 187C. Your flag is currently reading as an unauthorized, oxidized magenta. I stared at him. "You know the exact Pantone color of the mailbox flags?" "I take my job seriously, Leo. Property values depend on uniformity. If we let you have a pink flag, what's next? The Hendersons paint their front door teal? The Millers put up a chain-link fence? It's a slippery slope to anarchy, Leo." "Anarchy," I repeated, the word tasting ridiculous in my mouth. "Over a sun-faded piece of aluminum. It's not red, Leo. It's oxidized magenta." He actually smirked. A tiny, self-satisfied little lift of the corner of his mouth. "Richard, it's metal baking in the Florida sun. It's doing its best," I shot back, taking a step toward the golf cart. "I am not paying $15 because the earth revolves around the sun." Richard pushed his sunglasses back up, hiding his eyes again. The smirk vanished, replaced by the hardened mask of a petty tyrant whose authority had just been questioned in broad daylight. "Payment of the fine is an admission of fault, and it comes with a mandatory compliance timeline of 48 hours to replace the hardware," Richard recited, sounding like a broken robot programmed only for suburban misery. "If you don't pay it, the fees will compound. If you don't replace the flag, the fines will multiply. If you ignore this notice of intent to lien, we will legally encumber your property. It's your choice, Leo, but the HOA always gets its money." He didn't even wait for a response. He just pressed his foot on the accelerator, the electric motor whining as the lifted golf cart lurched forward, leaving me standing in a cloud of imaginary dust. I stood there for a long time. I looked at the mailbox. I looked at the little magenta flag. In the grand scheme of things, $15 was nothing. I could go inside, pull up the terrible, glitchy HOA payment portal, type in my credit card number, and make this go away. I could go to the local hardware store, buy a $3 can of cherry red spray paint, and hit the flag with 2 coats. The whole ordeal would cost me less than $20 and maybe 30 minutes of my life. It would be the smart thing to do. It would be the easy thing to do. But as I stood there in the suffocating humidity, clutching that pink slip of paper, something inside me snapped. A quiet, cold, rigid line was drawn in the sand of my soul. Paying that $15 wasn't just paying a fine. It was bending the knee. It was admitting that Richard Sterling, a man who voluntarily monitored the neighborhood with a clipboard and a police scanner, had the right to extort me over the inevitable decay of a metal object. It was yielding to a system designed entirely to bully people into compliance through the sheer annoyance of bureaucratic red tape. If I paid that fee, I was telling him he could do it again. Next time, it would be a weed in a flower bed. Then, a trash can angled 3 degrees too far to the left. I walked back up the driveway. I walked through the front door, the blast of air conditioning hitting me like a physical wall. I walked straight into the kitchen, marched over to the recycling bin, and dropped the bright pink notice of intent to LIEN right on top of a stack of junk mail grocery circulars. I wasn't paying it, not a dime. I grabbed an iced coffee from the fridge, walked out to my back lanai, and sat down. I knew what I was doing. I knew I was setting a ticking time bomb. I knew Richard Sterling would not let this go. He couldn't. His entire identity was wrapped up in enforcing these microscopic rules. But I also knew something Richard didn't. When you push someone over a matter of principle, you never know exactly how hard they are willing to push back. 3 months later, the bomb finally went off. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The rainy season had started, meaning the sky would open up every day at exactly 3:15 p.m., dump oceans of water on the neighborhood for exactly 20 minutes, and then clear up, leaving the air feeling like a hot bowl of soup. I was at my desk in my home office, finishing up some freelance client work, when I heard the unmistakable heavy thud of the mail carrier dropping a large stack of envelopes into the box out front. I walked out to grab the mail. The flag was still proudly, defiantly magenta. Mixed in with the bills and the credit card offers was a thick, heavy, oversized manila envelope. The return address didn't say Shady Palms HOA. It said Gottlieb, Hayes, and Vance, attorneys at law. A cold prickle of adrenaline washed over my skin. This wasn't a pink slip printed in Richard's home office. This was real, legal stationery. I carried it inside, threw it on the kitchen island, and grabbed a knife to slice it open. I pulled out a stack of documents roughly the thickness of a short novel. The front page was stamped with a county court seal. Complaint for foreclosure of Homeowners Association LIEN. I stopped breathing for a second. Foreclosure. They were actually trying to take my house. I leaned against the counter, my eyes scanning the dense legalese. I skipped past the boilerplate language about community standards and covenants, scrolling straight down to the financial breakdown. The original fine was listed at the top. Violation 4A7, mailbox hardware. 15 turbo dwellers beneath that, a cascading waterfall of pure, unadulterated extortion. Late fee, month 1, 50 Zuarsa late fee. Month 2, 50 Roysource late fee. Month 3, 50 Torsor Store HOA administrative processing fee, 250 Warsaw notice of intent. Filing fee, 150 Warsaw legal review. Retainer, 850 Warsaw attorney drafting fees, 1,200 Warsaw court filing fees, 435 Warsaw service of process fees, 150 Warsaw title search fees, $300 Sorkazer collection agency referral fee, $1,000. I stared at the grand total at the bottom of the page, the numbers blurring slightly. Total amount due to cure. Default $4,500. Our course from $15 to $4,500 in 90 days. It was a 30,000% markup. They had weaponized the legal system to turn a sun-faded flag into a massive payday for the association and their lawyers. And if I didn't pay it within 30 days, they would literally auction off my home, take their $4,500 from the proceeds, and leave me homeless over a mailbox. For a moment, panic set in. It's a very specific kind of panic when you realize an institution with more money and more lawyers than you is actively trying to destroy you. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to just drain my savings, pay the extortion fee, and paint the stupid flag. But as I kept staring at the paper, the panic burned off, leaving behind a cold, sharp, hyper-focused anger. They thought I was just some guy. They thought I was a soft target who would get a scary letter from a lawyer, wet my pants, and write a check. They thought this was an easy win. You want to take my house over $15? I thought, my hands gripping the edge of the granite countertop. Game on. I grabbed my laptop, marched into my office, and cracked my knuckles. If Richard Sterling wanted to play the legal game, we were going to play the legal game. But I wasn't going to play defense. In the state of Florida, homeowners associations operate under Chapter 720 of the Florida statutes. They are given enormous power over property owners, which is why they can foreclose on your house for unpaid fines. But that power comes with a trade-off. They are legally required to operate with extreme transparency. Their financial records, their meeting minutes, their contracts, it all belongs to the homeowners. It is all subject to inspection. I didn't need a lawyer right now. I needed a forensic accounting deep dive. I needed to know exactly how Shady Palms was spending its money. Because you don't aggressively pursue a $4,500 foreclosure on a $15 fine unless you are desperate for cash. I logged into the HOA's resident portal. The UI looked like it hadn't been updated since 2004. I navigated to the Corporate Documents tab. By law, they had to upload their annual budgets, reserve studies, and monthly expense reports. For the next 6 hours, I didn't leave my chair. I drank 3 more iced coffees. I built a massive spreadsheet. I downloaded PDFs, converted them to text, and started cross-referencing line items. First-person snark is one thing when you're arguing about a mailbox, but it reaches an entirely different level when you are tearing apart the financial ineptitude of a petty dictator. The budget was a disaster. It was a masterpiece of mismanagement. Richard Sterling had essentially been using the HOA coffers as his own personal country club fund. The landscaping budget was bloated by 40% because he insisted on planting exotic, high-maintenance orchids around the entrance signs, orchids that died every winter and had to be completely replaced. He had authorized a $15,000 security upgrade that consisted entirely of buying brand-new, top-of-the-line golf carts for himself and the vice president. But that was just the appetizer. I kept digging, looking for the main course. I found it in the meeting minutes from November of last year. Motion proposed by President Sterling, complete resurfacing and expansion of the community tennis courts, including imported clay and stadium lighting. Budget allocated, $250,000. I whistled low under my breath. $250,000. For a community of maybe 300 homes, that was a massive capital expenditure. I pulled up the reserve study, the document that legally dictates how much money the HOA has saved from major repairs. The reserve account only had $80,000 in it. So how did Richard pay for a $250,000 tennis court when the bank account was essentially empty? I opened the County Clerk of Court's website. This is public record. Anyone can search it if they know how to look. I typed in Shady Palms Homeowners Association into the official record search. Page after page of routine filings popped up. Mortgages, standard liens, deed transfers. I filtered the search to the last 6 months. And there it was. A glaring, beautiful anomaly. Document type, claim of lien, mechanics LIEN. Filing date, August 12th. Grantor, debtor, Shady Palms Homeowners Association. Grantee, creditor, Mike's Paving and Asphalt LLC. Amount, $82,450. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. The HOA was broke. They had contracted Mike's Paving to build the lavish tennis courts. They probably paid the initial deposit from the reserve funds, but when it came time to pay the final bill of $82,000, the well was dry. They stiffed the contractor. The contractor, rightfully furious, had slapped a mechanic's lien on the entire neighborhood's common areas. Richard was desperately trying to foreclose on homes to extract massive legal fees to artificially pump cash back into the HOA operating account before the residents found out the association was technically insolvent. But a mechanic's lien against an HOA is tricky. You can't easily foreclose on a community park or a tennis court. The contractor was stuck waiting for the HOA to scrape the money together, which could take years. I clicked on the PDF image of the actual lien document filed by the contractor. I wanted to see the details of the contract. As the image loaded on my screen, my eyes scanned down to the signature line of the original paving contract, which was attached as an exhibit. There was Richard Sterling's signature, large and arrogant. But right below it, in the tiny boilerplate legal text of the contract, I spotted something that made my heart hammer against my ribs. When you sign a contract on behalf of a corporation, and an HOA is a non-profit corporation, You sign as an officer. You have corporate immunity. If the HOA goes broke, the contractor can't come after your personal house or your personal bank account, unless the contractor's lawyer is smart. Big Mike's paving company had a very smart lawyer. Because the HOA's financials were so shaky at the time of signing, the paving company had inserted a specific clause. It was a personal guarantee. It explicitly stated that if the Shady Palms Homeowners Association defaulted on the payment, the individual signing the contract unconditionally guaranteed the debt personally. And to secure that personal guarantee, the signer had to pledge collateral. Richard Sterling, in his infinite arrogance, in his desperate need to have the nicest tennis courts in Boca Raton so he could play doubles on imported clay, had signed the personal guarantee. He had waived his corporate immunity. And for collateral? He hadn't put up his main house. He had put up the massive, newly constructed 200-square-foot guest estate he had just built on the empty lot next to his house, a property he was renting out for $3,000 a month. I sat in the glow of my monitors, the rain lashing against my office window, laughing softly to myself in the empty room. Richard Sterling was trying to take my home over a $15 faded mailbox flag. He didn't realize he had just handed me the legal leverage to take his house over an $80,000 unpaid paving bill. I mean, finding a paving contractor in South Florida who actually answers his phone is basically a miracle on a good day. Finding one who is currently embroiled in an $80,000 legal standoff with a neighborhood association run by a guy who drives a lifted golf cart? That requires some serious digital stalking. But honestly, I was highly motivated. It took me about 3 hours the next morning to track down the contact information for Mike's Paving and Asphalt, LLC. The company was registered to a Michael Vargas, operating out of a small industrial park in Pompano Beach, about 20 minutes south of Boca. I didn't want to just call him. If a random guy calls you up asking about a massive bad debt, you hang up. You assume it's a scam. I needed him to see that I was serious, and I needed him to see my face. I drove down to Pompano, navigating through a maze of concrete warehouses, auto body shops, and roofing suppliers, until I found a dusty lot filled with heavy rollers, dump trucks, and a small beige portable office trailer sitting on cinder blocks. I walked into the trailer. The air conditioning unit in the window was screaming, desperately fighting a losing battle against the Florida heat, and the air smelled like stale black coffee, diesel fuel, and old paperwork. Sitting behind a battered metal desk was a guy who looked like he had been poured out of concrete himself. He was massive, probably in his late 50s, wearing a high-visibility yellow shirt stained with grease. His hands looked like they were made of worn leather, and his eyes had the deep, hollow exhaustion of a man who spends his life arguing with suppliers and chasing down rich people for money they owe him. "Help you?" he grunted, not looking up from a stack of invoices. "I'm looking for Mike Vargas," I said. He finally looked up, eyeing me up and down. I was wearing a clean polo and jeans, looking aggressively like a guy who works on a laptop for a living. "You found him. We ain't hiring, and if you're selling SEO services, you can walk right back out that door." "I'm not selling anything," I said, pulling up a plastic chair uninvited and sitting across from him. "Actually, I want to buy something from you." Mike leaned back, the cheap chair groaning under his weight. "Yeah? What's that?" "Your headache," I said. Specifically, the $82,000 headache currently attached to the Shady Palms Homeowners Association. Mike's expression instantly darkened. The air in the trailer seemed to get 10 degrees hotter. He slammed a thick hand down on the desk, rattling a cup filled with pens. "You a lawyer for that pompous little country club freak?" Mike growled, his voice dropping an octave. "Because if you are, you can tell Dick Sterling I'll see him in court, and I don't care if it takes 3 years. I'm not settling for pennies. He wanted imported clay, he got imported clay, and now he's going to pay me." "I'm not his lawyer, Mike. I'm his neighbor," I said quickly, holding up my hands. And I hate him just as much as you do. Probably more, honestly, because I have to look at his stupid face every day. Mike narrowed his eyes. So what's your angle, kid? My angle is that Richard Sterling is currently trying to foreclose on my house over a $15 late fee for a sun-faded mailbox flag, I said. I could hear the absolute absurdity of it in my own voice. He's weaponizing the HOA's legal fund against me to extort $4,500 in bogus attorney fees, probably because he needs the cash to pad the accounts before the neighborhood finds out he bankrupted the association on your tennis courts. Mike stared at me for a long, quiet moment. Then, slowly, a deep, rumbling chuckle started in his chest. It turned into a full-blown laugh, loud and raspy. A mailbox flag? Mike wheezed, wiping a tear from his eye. He's trying to steal your house over a flag? Literally, yes. A $15 fine, I said. So, here's my proposition. I know you slapped a mechanic's lien on the common areas, and I know your lawyer was smart enough to get Richard to sign a personal guarantee using his guest house as collateral. Mike stopped laughing, looking impressed. You did your homework. Yeah, my guy insisted on it. Sterling was so desperate to get the courts done before the annual block party, he signed his life away. But a lot of good it does me right now. Foreclosing on a personal guarantee takes time. Lawyers take a third. It's tied up in the courts, and meanwhile, I got payroll to meet. Exactly, I said, leaning forward. You need liquidity. I need leverage. I have $40,000 sitting in a high-yield savings account. It's my life savings. Every dime I've scraped together from freelancing and side hustles. I will write you a cashier's check for $40,000 today, in cash, if you sign an assignment of debt transferring the $82,000, the mechanic's lien, and the personal guarantee to me. Mike stared at me. I mean, he literally didn't blink for a solid 10 seconds. You want to buy his debt? Mike said slowly, processing the math. You're taking a 50% haircut on my end, but you're taking over the legal risk. I'm buying the weapon, I corrected him. You get $40,000 cash right now. You wash your hands of Shady Palms, you make payroll, you move on with your life, and you don't have to pay a lawyer another hourly fee to chase this guy. I take over the debt, which means I become Richard Sterling's direct, legally recognized creditor. Mike scratched his chin, the stubble making a rasping sound. Kid, you know if you do this, you gotta enforce it yourself. If his lawyers find a loophole in my guy's contract, you're out $40,000. I've read the contract, Mike. The guarantee is ironclad. He waived corporate immunity, I said, my voice rock steady, even though my heart was doing kickflips in my chest. Will you do it? Mike looked at the stack of unpaid invoices on his desk. He looked at the screaming air conditioner. He looked back at me. Let's go call my lawyer, Mike said, standing up. It took 2 days to get the paperwork drafted and notarized. I went to my bank, and honestly, standing at the teller window and asking for a cashier's check for $40,000 was the most terrifying thing I've ever done. That was my safety net. That was my emergency fund. I was betting my entire financial future on my ability to out-petty an HOA president. But when I sat in the conference room of Mike's attorney's office and watched Mike sign the assignment of accounts receivable and debt, a profound sense of peace washed over me. I handed over the check. The lawyer handed me a thick folder containing the original contract, the promissory note, the LIEN documents, and the assignment transferring all rights, title, and interest to me. I walked out of that office holding a legal master key. But before I could use it, I had to secure my own perimeter. I couldn't launch an offensive strike while my own house was under siege. I drove home, sat down at my laptop, and logged into the Shady Palms HOA payment portal. My balance was staring at me in big red numbers, $4,500. I pulled out my credit card. My hand was physically shaking. Clicking Submit Payment for $4,500 over a mailbox flag felt like swallowing glass. It went against every instinct in my body. I watched the little loading circle spin, and then the screen flashed green. Payment successful. Balance, $0.00. I immediately emailed the receipt to the HOA's law firm, demanding an immediate withdrawal of the foreclosure complaint and a release of the lien on my property. They had their money. By law, they had to drop the case. 10 minutes later, I heard the whine of the electric golf cart. I looked out my window. Richard Sterling was doing a slow drive-by. He stopped at the edge of my driveway, looking at my house. I walked out the front door and stood on the porch. Richard gave me a massive, ear-to-ear, teeth-baring smile. He raised a hand and gave me a little mock salute. He had clearly just gotten the notification that I paid up. He thought he broke me. He thought he had asserted his dominance, crushed my spirit, and replenished his precious HOA legal fund all in one fell swoop. I didn't wave back. I just smiled. A quiet, knowing, dead-eyed smile. "Enjoy the victory lap, Dick," I thought. "It's your last one." I went back inside and opened a blank Word document. It was time to draft the single most aggressive piece of correspondence I have ever written in my life. It didn't need to be long. It just needed to be legally devastating. To Richard Sterling, individually and personally. From Leo, my last name, assignee of debt. Subject: Notice of assignment and demand for payment in full. Dear Mr. Sterling, please be advised that as of yesterday, I have legally purchased and assumed all rights, title, and interest to the debt originally owed by the Shady Palms Homeowners Association to Mike's Paving and Asphalt, LLC, in the amount of 82,250 pounds. As you are aware, you signed a personal guarantee for this debt on May 14th, pledging your secondary property located at 402 Shady Palms Court, Guest Estate, as collateral and waiving all corporate protections. As the new legal creditor of this account, I am formally calling the debt. You have 72 hours to remit a cashier's check for the full amount of 82,450 pounds plus accrued statutory interest. Failure to deliver payment in full by 5 p.m. this Friday will result in immediate legal action to execute the personal guarantee up to and including the seizure and public auction of your collateral property. I look forward to your prompt payment. Warmly, Leo. I printed it out on heavy cardstock. I wanted it to feel substantial. I put it in a crisp white envelope. I didn't want to mail it. Mailing it would take too long, and I wanted to see his face. But I also knew Richard was unhinged, and approaching him directly on his property was risky. Luckily, I didn't have to go far. The next morning, Saturday, I saw Richard out in his driveway. He was washing his metallic silver golf cart. He actually had a bucket of soapy water and a microfiber cloth, carefully scrubbing the rims like it was a vintage Ferrari. I walked out of my house, holding the envelope. I strolled down the sidewalk, the morning heat already making the air shimmer above the asphalt. Richard saw me coming. He stood up, wiping his hands on a towel, that smug, victorious grin plastered across his face. "Morning, Leo," he called out, his voice practically dripping with condescension. "Got that flag fixed yet? You know, the compliance window is still open. Hate to have to fine you again after you just got your account caught up." "Actually, Richard, I'm not here about the flag," I said, stopping at the edge of his driveway. I held out the envelope. "I have a delivery for you." He frowned, looking at the envelope. "What is that? If you are submitting an architectural request, it needs to go through the portal." "It's not an architectural request. It's a formal notice," I said. "You should probably read it." He stepped forward, snatched the envelope out of my hand, and tore it open. I stood there, perfectly still, watching his face. It was like watching a time-lapse video of a flower wilting. First, his eyes scanned the header. The smugness flickered. Then, his eyes darted back and forth as he read the body of the letter. The blood literally drained from his face, leaving his tan skin looking like grayish putty. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He read it twice, maybe 3 times. "This," he stammered, his hands actually trembling. "This is a joke. This is forgery. You didn't buy a paving debt." "I absolutely did, Richard," I said, my voice calm, pleasant, and completely devoid of mercy. "Mike Vargas says hello, by the way. He was very happy to cash my check." You paid him?" Richard's voice cracked. "I bought the debt, Richard. That means I own the paper. That means you owe me 82 grand. Personally, because you were dumb enough to sign a personal guarantee with an empty HOA bank account. I gestured to the massive, beautiful guest house sitting on the lot next to his main property. That's a nice guest house. Must pull in a lot of rental income. Shame if something happened to the title. Richard's shock instantly morphed into explosive, panicked rage. This is extortion, he screamed, his voice echoing off the terracotta roofs. You're extorting me. This is illegal. You can't just buy a debt to harass me. It's not harassment, Richard. It's capitalism. I saw an undervalued asset, your massive liability, and I acquired it. You have 72 hours to pay me, or I'm taking the guest house. I'm calling the police, Richard yelled, actually pulling his cell phone out of his pocket. You're threatening me on my own property. You're trespassing. I'm standing on the public sidewalk, Dick, I said, pointing straight down at my feet. And please, call the police. I would love for them to mediate this. He dialed 911 right in front of me, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped the phone. He started screaming into the receiver that a neighbor was harassing him, threatening to steal his home, and producing fake legal documents to extort money. I didn't move. I just crossed my arms and waited. It took about 15 minutes for a Boca Raton PD cruiser to slowly roll down the street. The car parked against the curb, and a single officer stepped out. Officer Martinez. Martinez looked like a guy who had joined the force to bust drug cartels and instead found himself mediating disputes over lawn clippings and loud pool pumps. He adjusted his heavy duty belt, let out a deep, soul-weary sigh, and walked up the driveway. All right, who called? Martinez asked, pulling out a small notepad. I did, officer. Richard practically sprinted toward him, pointing a trembling finger at me. This man is stalking me. He came to my house, handed me forged documents, and is trying to extort me for $80,000. He's threatening to steal my property. Martinez raised an eyebrow and turned to me. Sir, you want to explain what's going on here? I'd love to, Officer Martinez, I said, keeping my hands visible, and my voice perfectly level. Mr. Sterling here is the president of our HOA. Recently, the HOA failed to pay a paving contractor for a community project. Because the HOA was broke, Mr. Sterling signed a personal guarantee for the debt, using his property as collateral. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a neatly folded copy of the assignment of debt and the original contract with Richard's signature. I handed them to Martinez. I purchased that debt from the contractor, I explained. I am now legally the creditor. I simply walked over here, stayed on the public sidewalk, and handed Mr. Sterling a standard 72-hour demand letter for payment, which is legally required before I file for summary judgment. He didn't like that, so he called you. Officer Martinez took the papers. He read the assignment. He looked at the signature on the guarantee. He looked at the notary stamp. Then, a small, subtle smirk tugged at the corner of Martinez's mouth. He clearly knew Richard. Every cop in Boca probably knew Richard from his constant, frivolous calls about people parking an inch too close to a fire hydrant. Martinez handed the papers back to me. He turned to Richard, flipping his notepad shut. Mr. Sterling, Martinez said, his voice flat. Arrest him, Richard demanded. He's trying to steal my house. Mr. Sterling, this is a civil matter, Martinez said, speaking slowly, like he was explaining gravity to a toddler. This man has legal documentation showing you owe him a substantial amount of money. Serving a demand letter is not a crime. It is the legal process. But he's harassing me. He bought the debt just to ruin me. Why he bought the debt isn't a police matter, Martinez replied. The fact is, he holds the paper. If you believe the documents are forged, hire a lawyer and take it up in civil court. But if you call 911 again, because a creditor asked you to pay a bill you signed for, I'm going to cite you for misuse of the emergency dispatch system. Richard stared at the cop, completely frozen. His entire worldview, a world where he made the rules, where he commanded authority, where his clipboard was law, was crumbling in real time. Pay your bills, Dick, Officer Martinez said quietly. Have a nice day. Martinez tipped his hat to me, got back in his cruiser, and drove away. I looked at Richard. He was staring at the ground, His shoulders slumped, the soapy microfiber cloth still gripped tightly in his hand. 72 hours, Richard, I said softly. I turned around and walked back to my house. My mailbox flag was still magenta, and it had never looked more beautiful. 72 hours. That is exactly 3 days, or 4,320 minutes, of absolute pin-drop silence from the house next door. I mean, I literally spent the entire weekend just sipping iced coffee on my lanai, waiting for the inevitable explosion. But Richard didn't come over. He didn't call the cops again. He just completely ghosted the situation, probably assuming that if he ignored it, my legally binding demand letter would just magically evaporate into the humid Florida air. On Monday morning, exactly at 9:30 a.m., my email pinged. It wasn't a check. It was a PDF from Gottlieb, Hayes, and Vance, the HOA's law firm. It was a cease and desist letter, aggressively demanding that I stop harassing their client and threatening to countersue me for intentional infliction of emotional distress. I honestly just laughed out loud in my empty office. Here is the thing about HOA lawyers. They are paid by the association to protect the association. They are not paid to protect Richard Sterling's personal real estate portfolio. I knew, with absolute certainty, that the moment Richard handed them my demand letter, the senior partner took one look at that signed personal guarantee, realized Richard had completely compromised himself outside of the HOA's corporate umbrella, and told him he was on his own. The cease and desist was just a scary piece of paper with zero legal weight behind it, a desperate bluff to make me back down. I didn't back down. I drove straight to the Palm Beach County Courthouse. Filing a lawsuit against a neighbor is like a deeply surreal experience. You stand in line behind people getting traffic tickets and filing for divorce, and you hand a bored clerk a stack of papers that will fundamentally alter someone's life. I filed a complaint for breach of contract and immediately filed a motion for summary judgment. Summary judgment is a beautiful legal concept. It basically means you go to the judge and say, "Hey, look at this evidence. It is so undeniably clear that we don't even need a trial. Just rule in my favor right now." Because I had the original paving contract, the notarized assignment of debt, and Richard's unquestionable signature on the personal guarantee, there was nothing to debate. It wasn't a he said, she said situation. It was a he signed, I own situation. The hearing was set for 3 weeks later. Those 3 weeks in Shady Palms were tense. Richard drove his golf cart past my house every single day, but he wouldn't look at me. He stared straight ahead. His jaw clenched so tight I'm surprised his teeth didn't shatter. The magenta flag waved proudly in the breeze every time he passed. When court day finally arrived, I wore my best suit. I walked into courtroom 4B, which smelled like floor wax and old wood, and took a seat at the plaintiff's table. 10 minutes later, Richard walked in. He looked terrible. The confident, pastel-wearing dictator was gone. He was wearing a suit that looked like it hadn't been tailored since 2008, and he was sweating profusely. He had a lawyer with him, a nervous-looking guy with a cheap briefcase who clearly wasn't from the high-priced HOA firm. Judge Davies, an older woman with zero patience for nonsense, and a gaze that could cut through steel, took the bench. She opened the file, adjusted her reading glasses, and looked down at us. "All right. I have a motion for summary judgment here regarding a defaulted commercial debt that was personally guaranteed," Judge Davies said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "Mr. Sterling, your counsel has filed a response claiming this debt is the responsibility of the Shady Palms Homeowners Association. Is that correct?" Richard's lawyer stood up, clearing his throat. "Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Sterling was acting in his official capacity as president of the association when he signed the contract for the paving services. The corporate veil should protect him from personal liability." Judge Davies looked at the lawyer like he had just tracked mud onto her clean carpet. "Counselor, I am looking at Exhibit B, the paving contract," she said coldly. "And right here, under the section clearly labeled Unconditional Personal Guarantee, is your client's signature. It explicitly waives corporate immunity. Did your client sign this document or not? The lawyer swallowed hard. He did, Your Honor. But we argue it was signed under duress. Stop right there, Judge Davies interrupted, holding up a hand. Unless you have a police report proving the paving contractor held a gun to his head, there is no duress. Your client wanted a tennis court, the association didn't have the funds, and he pledged his own assets to get it built. That is the definition of a personal guarantee. She turned her gaze to me. And you, sir, you purchased this debt legally from the original contractor? Yes, Your Honor, I said, standing up. I hold the notarized assignment of debt. I sent a 72-hour demand letter which was ignored. Judge Davies nodded, closing the file with a decisive smack. The documentation is pristine, she announced. There is no genuine dispute of material fact here. The defendant signed the guarantee, the debt is in default, and the plaintiff owns the paper. Motion for summary judgment is granted. Richard let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He literally slumped against the defense table. Judgment is entered in favor of the plaintiff in the amount of $82,450, the judge continued, writing on her docket, plus statutory interest and court costs. Have a good day, gentlemen. The gavel came down. It was the loudest, most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my life. But a judgment is just a piece of paper that says someone owes you money. It doesn't magically put cash in your bank account. If Richard had just written me a check right then and there, this all would have been over. But he didn't. He couldn't. Like most guys who project extreme wealth by driving custom golf carts and living in gated communities, his money was completely tied up in illiquid assets. So I took the next legal step. I took my judgment to the county clerk and requested a writ of execution. This is where the malicious compliance reaches its absolute peak. A writ of execution is a court order that commands the county sheriff to seize the debtor's property, sell it at a public auction, and give the proceeds to the creditor to satisfy the judgment. And because Richard had specifically listed his newly built $400,000 guest estate as the collateral on the personal guarantee, I didn't have to go hunting for his assets. I pointed the sheriff directly at the property line next door. 2 weeks later, the sheriff's deputies arrived at Richard's house. They didn't come in a golf cart. They came in actual squad cars. They walked up to the guest house, knocked on the door, informed the terrified renters that the property was being levied, and posted a massive neon orange notice of sheriff's sale on the front window. The auction was scheduled for 30 days later, right on the courthouse steps. I literally marked it on my calendar with a magenta highlighter. The morning of the auction was a crisp, clear Florida Tuesday. I stood on the concrete steps of the Palm Beach County Courthouse, holding my certified judgment paperwork. A small crowd of real estate investors and flippers had gathered around the deputy who was running the auction. Next up, the property located at 402 Shady Palms Court, Guest Estate, the deputy announced, reading from a clipboard. Opening bid will start at the judgment amount of $87,112, which includes all accrued interest and fees. A guy in a cheap suit raised his hand to bid. I stepped forward. Excuse me, I am the primary judgment creditor. I am exercising my right to a credit bid. In a sheriff's auction, if you are the person who holds the debt, you don't have to bring cash. You can just bid the exact amount of the debt you are owed. It's called a credit bid. The deputy checked his paperwork, nodded at me, and looked at the crowd. We have a credit bid of $87,112. Do I hear 90? The real estate investors looked at each other. The guest house was easily worth $400,000, but buying a property at a sheriff's sale means buying it with all its potential headaches, title issues, and whatever crazy neighbor drama is attached to it. Given that Richard was currently pacing on the sidewalk 50 feet away, glaring at everyone like a cornered raccoon, no one wanted to touch it. Going once, the deputy called out. Richard yelled something unintelligible from the sidewalk. Going twice, I smiled. Sold. To the judgment creditor. I exhaled a breath I felt like I had been holding for 3 months. It was done. For the price of a $40,000 gamble and a $15 late fee, I had just legally seized a $400,000 piece of prime Boca Raton real estate. The transition of power was honestly poetic. Armed with the freshly recorded sheriff's deed, I drove back to Shady Palms. I didn't park in my driveway. I parked directly in the driveway of 402 Shady Palms Court, my property. The renters had already packed up and broken their lease the moment the neon orange sign went up, leaving the guest house completely empty. I unlocked the front door, walked inside, and just took it all in. Hardwood floors, quartz countertops, a massive walk-in shower. Richard had spared no expense building his little rental empire, all while driving the HOA into the ground. I walked back outside and pulled out my phone. I dialed a number I had saved in my favorites. "Mike's Paving, how can I help you?" A gruff voice answered. "Hey, Big Mike, it's Leo, the kid from Boca," I said. "Leo," Mike boomed through the speaker. "My man, I heard through the grapevine you actually pulled it off. You took the house." "I took the house, Mike?" I laughed. "Listen, I have a job for you. I need a contractor. I just bought a new property, and honestly, the driveway is a complete disaster. The asphalt color is it's really harshing my vibe. I need it completely torn up and replaced." "Where's the property?" Mike asked, though I could already hear the grin in his voice. "Directly next door to Richard Sterling's primary residence," I said, "and I need it done as loudly as legally permissible." "Kid, I'm sending a crew with a jackhammer and a skid steer tomorrow at 7 a.m. sharp," Mike laughed. "On the house." The next morning was a symphony of destruction. Exactly at 7:02 a.m., the massive diesel engines of Mike's heavy machinery rumbled into Shady Palms. A crew of 4 guys, wearing high-visibility vests and holding cups of coffee, unloaded a pneumatic jackhammer and walked straight onto the pristine asphalt of my new guest house driveway. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat. The noise echoed through the quiet, manicured streets like a war zone. It was beautiful. It took exactly 4 minutes for the front door of Richard's main house to fly open. He came sprinting across his lawn, still wearing his silk pajamas and a pair of leather slippers. He looked completely unhinged. His hair was sticking up in all directions, and his face was a deep, dangerous shade of purple. "Stop! Stop right now!" Richard screamed over the deafening roar of the jackhammer. He waved his arms frantically at the crew. "Shut that equipment down! This is a gated community. You can't do this." Big Mike, who had personally driven the dump truck out to supervise, leaned against the hood, crossed his arms, and smiled. He didn't say a word. He just pointed a thick, calloused finger at me. I was standing on the porch of the guest house, sipping an iced coffee. Richard's eyes locked onto mine, and he marched across the lawn, his slippers slipping on the wet morning grass. "Leo," he bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You can't do this. You don't have HOA approval for this construction. I'm the president, and I am issuing a stop work order right now. I'm calling the police." I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the vanilla syrup. "Actually, Dick, you're not the president anymore," I said, speaking loudly over the machinery. He froze. "What?" "Yeah, I meant to tell you," I said, leaning against the porch railing. After I did my little deep dive into the HOA financials to find the mechanic's lien, I noticed a few other things, like the 40% markup on the landscaping budget, and the $15,000 for your custom golf cart. I took all those spreadsheets, packed them into a nice, neat little PDF, and emailed them to every single homeowner in Shady Palms on Sunday night. Richard's jaw dropped. The color completely drained from his face for the second time in our relationship. "The board held an emergency session last night while you were busy sulking," I continued, smiling sweetly. "They voted unanimously to suspend you pending a full forensic audit for commingling funds and gross financial mismanagement. So, as of 9 p.m. yesterday, you have no authority." He stood there, hyperventilating, his silk pajamas fluttering in the morning breeze. "Oh, and one more thing," I added, pulling a piece of paper from my back pocket and unfolding it. "Because the vice president is now acting president, and because he was deeply appreciative of me exposing the fact that you nearly bankrupted the neighborhood, he approved my architectural request for the driveway replacement this morning at 6 a.m. I held up the paper. It was stamped with the official Shady Palms HOA seal. "It's fully permitted, Dick. We're going with a nice, crushed concrete look. Very modern." Richard looked at the approved permit. He looked at Big Mike, who gave him a cheerful, mocking wave. He looked at the jackhammer, which was currently tearing a massive, jagged hole into the driveway he had obsessively maintained for 5 years. He didn't scream. He didn't threaten me. The fight completely left his body, leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. He just turned around, walked slowly back to his house, and shut the door. 2 weeks later, a moving truck showed up at Richard's house. He couldn't handle the shame. He couldn't handle the angry stares from the neighbors who realized he had squandered their reserve funds. But mostly, I think he couldn't handle the fact that every time he walked out his front door, he had to look at my newly paved driveway, and he had to look at me, the guy who broke his empire over a $15 fine. He listed his house for sale and moved to a condo in Boca West. As for me, I kept the house. I rent out the guest estate to a very nice couple who are pediatric nurses. The rental income pays my mortgage, my utilities, and covers the taxes, leaving me with a couple of grand in pure passive income every single month. Big Mike and I grab a beer every couple of weeks, and he still laughs until he chokes when he tells the story of the HOA president who lost his house over a driveway. Shady Palms is actually a pretty nice place to live now. The new board is relaxed. They focus on maintaining the pool and keeping the gates working, and they leave the residents alone. But just to be safe, I did make one minor adjustment to my property. I went to the hardware store. I bought a can of spray paint, and I painted my mailbox flag. It's not cherry red. It's not oxidized magenta. It is the brightest, most aggressive, fluorescent, hot pink I could legally find, and no one has said a single word about it.